Hello, this is Domenico with Easynomics, and we're going to go over a macroeconomic concept, that being the Keynesian multiplier. And our applied example is going to be looking at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the US macroeconomy. This was a global recession impacting um, nearly all, perhaps definitely all nations, but we're going to look specifically at the United States. We're going to be using some information from the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis, and this is their advanced estimate for quarter two 2020, the impact on GDP of the mandated lockdown on real GDP, significant decline in consumption spending. And here we can see that dramatic percentage decrease in the second quarter of the year 2020, about a 32% decline in real GDP. And if we look a little bit further, we have the specific data. GDP decreased by 34.3%, or $2.5 trillion. That is the recessionary gap that was formed as a result of the pandemic. And we can illustrate that in a Keynesian or Montrose model. And we're going to look at the idea behind the Keynesian multiplier as to why the United States, through the CARES Act, was providing stimulus checks to households to stimulate consumption spending, to boost AD. And this all relates to the idea of the Keynesian multiplier, fiscal multiplier. So let's begin to understand this. So first, let's take a look at what happened to the United States. And using the Keynesian model that we see here, we have our Keynesian aggregate supply curve. We have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve. We know that aggregate demand is equal to consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus exports minus imports, right? Essentially, aggregate demand is real GDP, which is being measured on the x-axis. The intersection of the aggregate demand curve with the aggregate supply curve at point A provides a price level at PL1 and real GDP, we're going to assume, at full potential GDP, or YP. Because of the mandated lockdown, consumption spending fell, and likely investment spending fell, and also likely because of the lockdown, exports from the United States also fell. So that would cause the aggregate demand curve to shift in, let's say from 81 to 82. That would set a new equilibrium at point B, which we see here. The price level is going to fall from PL1 to PL2, signaling disinflation, and there is a decline in real GDP by 34%, as we saw in that previous website that was listed. We'll say that it fell from YP to Y recession, let's say 1. Okay. Now, here we have the formation of a recessionary gap. The distance between 81 and 82 being approximately a 34% decrease in GDP, or the equivalent of, as we saw on that previous website, $2.5 trillion. Right? I think we go back, we'll see $2.15 trillion decline in real GDP. So the gap here, if I was to illustrate this, the gap between here and here is approximately 2.15 trillion US dollars. Now, we know, as we've studied macroeconomics, the Keynesian ideology highlights that since the aggregate supply curve cannot shift due to sticky prices, everything is dependent on aggregate demand to move. And as a result of this recessionary gap, the US economy would sit at point B unless some component of aggregate demand changed, that being perhaps government spending, or government spending or providing transfer payments to households to initiate, let's say, consumption spending, to begin to push 80 outward, from 82 outward towards 81, to close that recessionary gap. Now, how was that done? The US CARES Act was providing funding stimulus checks or transfer payments to the household to initiate consumption spending. So again, if we look at the CARES Act, here it said U.S. government spending, $300 billion. This was composed of transfer payments, one-time cash payments or transfer payments to households. In the first round of stimulus checks, about $1,200. All right, single adults receiving about $1,200 of additional income. So that relates to the Keynesian multiplier. The Keynesian multiplier is trying to think, if we were to provide additional income, what percentage of that would be spent to initiate further spending in the economy? That's the idea. So we'll go over the formula and so forth, but let's just go over this matrix to see how this would work with a simple example. So let's say the government provides additional income to the household. So here we have different households, households 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, onwards. And delta is the change and Y is income. And we're going to change the household's income by the government providing an additional sum of money. In this case, to the first household, $10. And that will initiate a change in consumption spending and it will also lead to some withdrawals. The MPW is the marginal propensity to withdrawal, which is the sum. If we make a couple of notes here, just so we know what that is. The marginal propensity to withdrawal is the sum of any money that is saved plus any money that is taxed plus any money that leaves the country as a result of imports. So it's going to be the sum of the leakages. Again, it's the savings plus money that is withdrawn due to taxation plus imports. Essentially, in the circular flow, these are the leakages, money leaking out of the circular flow. But the consumption spending will lead to injections. So let's assume that on average, the household will spend 60% of any additional income. That is the assumption here. Income in economics, symbol Y. So the household, on average, throughout the United States, we will assume will spend 60% of any additional income. So if the U.S. government is going to provide a transfer payment to the household of $10, we'll assume that the household will spend about 60% of that. And that will be $6 here. And $4 is being withdrawn in terms of savings, taxes, and imports. So 6 plus 4 is 10. $6 spent, $4 saved or taxed or spent on imported goods. When the household, that first household spends $6, they're buying goods and services that perhaps will go to another household. Maybe it's going to another firm, but the entrepreneur gaining those $6 will bring it back to their household. So let's assume that that additional spending of $6 goes to the next household. They get $6 thanks to household 1 spending 6. And from that $6, they're going to spend 60%. So that works out to 3.6. And we're going to round up with the decimal values up to the second significant figure. And they're going to save $2.4. Okay, so that additional $6 from the first household is going to the second household that is providing goods and services that was purchased by the first household. Second household will spend $3.60 and will save $2.4. When that second household spends $3.60, it's going to eventually end up in household number 3. So that household will get $3.60, and they're going to spend $2.16, and they are going to save $1.44. That additional $2.16 of spending will eventually end up in another household that will spend $1.30, and they will save 0.86 cents. Okay, that $1.30 will end up in household number 3. They will spend 60% of that, which is 78 cents, and they will save perhaps 0.52, save taxed or imports purchased. The 78 cents that's spent by household 5 will now end up in household number 6. And they're going to spend 60% of that, and that will be 0.47. And of that, let's assume that about 31 cents is saved, taxed, and imported. That additional 47 cents will go to household number 7, and they will spend 60% of that, which is 28 cents. And then the withdrawals or the leakages will be about 19 cents, money that is saved, taxed, or sent abroad due to imported goods, and so on. All right, so I'm just going to keep going through this. This is a little bit tedious, but this is to prove a point. Here we have household number 8 getting 28 cents. They will spend 17 cents. And they will save or a certain amount will be taxed or leave the country as imports are purchased, 11 cents. 17 cents going to household number 9. They will spend 60% of that, so about 10 cents. Let's say about 7 cents withdrawn. Then 10 cents ends up in household number 10. They will spend 60% of that, so we see right here. Of the 10 cents, 60% is spent, with 4 cents being a leakage. Then 6 cents goes to household number 11. 60% of that will be spent. And of that, it's about 2 cents saved. And then here we're getting very close to the end, 0.4 cents received by household number 12. And they're going to spend 60% of that. That's going to round up to about 0.02. And that's going to be about 0.02 of withdrawals. 2 cents ending up in household number 13. If we round up, that's 1 cent that's spent. It should be 60%, but we're going to round up to that second decimal figure. And then about a cent that is withdrawn. And then the last cent ending up in household number 14. And they will spend none of it, because we can't take the fractional value, 60% of that. So there we are at the very, very end. So the government introduces $10 to the first household. That is the stimulus money going to that first household. And we can see how it creates this ripple effect, this chain effect of spending throughout the economy. The initial $10 received by the household as additional income is spent as consumption. $6, 60% is spent, with 4% being withdrawn. And those $6 end up in household number 2. They spend 60%, it ends up in household number 3, and they spend 60%. So you get the idea. Now, let's take a look. If we total the change in income, right, and income is the same as GDP, if we add all these numbers up, $10, $6, and so forth, we're going to see that at the bottom here, that is $24.99, essentially $25, all right, because we've lost some fractional values because we rounded up. If we look at the consumption spending, the changes in consumption spending, the $6 add to 3.6, 2.60, and so forth, we're going to see here that totals $14.99, essentially $15. And if we look at the marginal propensity to withdrawal, this is all of the savings, taxation, and imports, money that leaked out of the economy. We add up $4 and 2.4 and 1.4 and so forth. We're going to see here that it equals 9.99 or $10. So right here, this $10 of the leakage is equal to the initial transfer payment sent to that first household, a fraction saved, and so forth. And as it goes through this ripple effect, the sum of all of these savings or taxation imports should be equal to the initial amount that was injected into the economy. Now, what's interesting is we have just introduced $10, but we got an additional $15 of spending, or a total of $25 of spending in the total economy. So by introducing $10, GDP grew 2.5 times. And that is the concept of the Keynesian multiplier. Now let's take a look at that. Some important vocabulary terms. The first one is the marginal propensity to consume, which we call the MPC. And I'll have notes in the information section just to highlight that. But this is the marginal propensity to consume. On average, what percent of additional income is spent by the household? So the MPC essentially is equal to the change in consumption as a result of a change in income. If the household gains some additional income, what's the change to their consumption spending? And we've stated that the household spends 60%. So the MPC in our case is equal to 0.6 or 0.60 over 1. What does that mean? That anytime we increase household income by 1%, we increase the income by 1%, then we should expect an increase in consumption spending by 0.6%. That is the idea of the MPC. An additional dollar, of that additional dollar of income, 60 cents will be spent. Some other key terms includes the marginal propensity to save, MPS, the marginal propensity to save. And that is the change in savings as a result of the change in income. All right, so let's say that any additional income, a portion of that will be saved. And let's say that the MPS, in our example, maybe it's 0.2. That's 0.2 over 1. So every time incomes increase, let's say, by 1%, that will lead to 0.2% being saved, or for every additional dollar, 20 cents will be saved by the household. Some other key vocabulary terms that relates to the Keynesian multiplier is the marginal propensity to tax, which is the change in taxation as a result of a change in income. And let's say that the value here is 0.1. So let's say the MPT equals 0.1, which is 0.1 over 1, meaning that for every 1% increase in income, 0.1% of it will be taxed, or for every additional dollar, 10 cents will be taxed. And to complete that, we're going to squeeze in one more. This is the marginal propensity to import. All right, and that is equal to change in buying imported goods as a result of a change in income. And let's say again that this is 0.1 over 1. So if I get an additional dollar, I will spend 10 cents of it on imported goods, and those 10 cents will leak out of my domestic economy. So we notice that 0.6, the MPC is 0.6, plus the marginal propensity to save is 0.2, plus the marginal propensity to tax is 0.1, plus the marginal propensity to import is 0.1. This all adds up to 1. 1 being for every dollar you get, what can you do with it? For every dollar, we're going to assume that 60 cents is spent, 20 cents is saved, 10 cents is taxed, and 10 cents is sent out to buy imported goods. So let's look at the formula for the Keynesian multiplier and see how it relates to this data here. And then we will be done. So not to keep this video too long, I'll probably provide some additional videos to illustrate the calculations of the multiplier. But this is just a kind of a dense introduction to it. So the Keynesian multiplier is a formula which is equal to, there's two ways to calculate it, 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, which is also equal to 1 over, this is the other formula, the marginal propensity to save plus the marginal propensity to tax plus the marginal propensity to import. So on an exam, on an IB exam, they would either give you the data for the marginal propensity to tax, save, tax, and import, or they will give you the marginal propensity to consume. Here we have the marginal propensity to consume being 60% or 0.6. So we can calculate it as 1 over 1 minus 0.6, which is equal to the leakage, 1 over 0.4, right? Which is this, 1 over the marginal propensity to save, tax, and imports. Money leaking out of the economy. And that is equal to 2.5. Now this is important. That is the multiplier. That means that for any additional dollar injected into the economy, you're going to get 2.5 times more spending in that economy. And that is true. Look at this. We've introduced $10, and $10, when we injected $10 into the economy with the Keynesian multiplier of 2.5 as a result of household spending on average 60%, that led to $25 of total spending in the economy. $10, look at the total spending here, $25. The initial injection multiplied by 2.5 gave us $25 of total spending as a result of household spending about 60% of any additional income. So if the US recessionary gap in the second quarter of 2020 was $2.15 trillion, and we're going to assume that households will spend 60% of any additional income, how much does the government have to spend or inject into the economy to close this gap? And that is the application of the Keynesian multiplier. So we're going to do that, and then we'll be done. So take a look here. Here we have this recessionary gap of 2.15 trillion, right? We're going to assume that US households have an MPC. The MPC value is 0.6. 60% of any additional income will be spent. Again, using the Keynesian multiplier, so it's 1 over 1 minus the MPC, which is equal to 1 over 1 minus 0.6, which is equal to, we'll put it over here, 1 over 0.4, which is equal to 2.5. So if the recessionary gap is 2.15 trillion, right, we're going to say, what amount of money needs to be injected into the economy, right? What amount of money needs to be injected into the economy so that it can multiply 2.5 times to close a recessionary gap of 2.15 trillion. Okay? So if economists can calculate the propensity to consume, then they'll have an idea of what the injection by the government should be. If the multiplier is 2.5, then we can take 2.15 trillion divided by 2.5, and that will give us what the injection should be. And that works out to 860 billion. So this amount would be $860 billion of government transfer payments to the household, which will multiply 2.5 times to achieve $2.15 trillion of total spending to close this gap. So we can see that AD will initially shift out from 81 to 82, or from 82 to 83, I should say. And that is point C, and that is still in a recessionary gap initially, from Y recession 1 to Y recession 2. So we'll have an initial change in aggregate demand from 82 to 83 as a result of the first household getting that initial $10, or the US government providing $860 billion of transfer payments to households. So here is what we call the autonomous spending. which in this case is going to be equal to $860 billion. That will lead to the multiplier effect, the ripple effect of all of these households spending more and more money. And so 83 will also shift out eventually back to 81, which is what we call the induced spending. And that will achieve $2.15 trillion of total spending with the initial government injection of $860 billion. So the government does not have to spend or provide transfer payments in the amount of $2.15 trillion. They just have to provide an initial injection that will multiply out to close the recessionary gap. With the data here, it would be, instead of $2.15 trillion, it would be total spending of 25 with the initial injection of 10. And that causes an additional amount of spending, which is right here, of 15. So the autonomous spending was $10 right here, creating additional induced spending of 15 as a result of this ripple effect that we see here. And in total, that is $25. So we can close that recessionary gap of $25 just with an initial injection of 10 that multiplies out as a result of household spending 60%. So in the next video, we'll talk about what happens when the MPC value changes when it's 90% or 50% of any additional income is spent. We'll take a look at that and some of the math behind it. But that's the idea of the Keynesian multiplier. If you have any questions, feel free to comment. Don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.